So I now have the honor to invite our Emeritus Professor Richard Saunders to chair the next session and panel discussion. Included in the panel are Professor Hong Lin. Oh no, he can't make it now because Professor Hong Lin from China, he wasn't able to get his visa in time to come to the UK, and therefore he has to withdraw. But I have the honor to invite Professor Jeremy Clark, but also Stephen Catchpole, CEO of South East Midlands and Local Enterprise Partnership here, and also Professor Guy Liu as well on the panel. Again, apologize for the chaos because again, Shlomo Taba has to withdraw earlier as well for a flight.
You go first then. Okay, actually it's a pity there are so few people here left, because I would just like to say at this juncture that we ought to give an awful lot of appreciation and gratitude to He Xiaohui for having organised what I think is one of the most stimulating conferences I've ever been to, in the context of bringing together academics, practitioners from all different sides of the issue pertaining to Chinese overseas investment abroad. I set up the China Centre 17 years ago with a conference which also included academics and practitioners. I'm very, very glad that He Xiaohui was able to carry on the tradition. And I'm also very glad to say that he's carrying on the work of the China Centre. So thank you very much, He Xiaohui, and I think we should perhaps give him, before anybody else leaves, we should give him a vote of applause. This obviously will be the final session. We still have an illustrious panel, and I've suggested that we perhaps try and wrap it all up by about 10 to 5. So it will be, if you like, a concluding opportunity for people to say a few words, and then there'll be a few opportunities for questions and final comments. I hope that's okay for everybody. Dylan Sutherland, actually I met Dylan many years back at Cambridge, and he's going to kick off currently at Durham University with some discussion around statistics, and generally also I think we'll look in. This session was actually originally called Chinese Overseas Investment Statistics, and I thought it was a much better idea to talk about evidence, to the extent of, to what extent, what are the myths, what are the realities. So if we could start with Dylan, and then we will move on to Jeremy from Professor Jeremy Clegg from the University of Leeds, and then we'll have an opportunity to listen to Stephen Catchpole, who comes from the South East Midlands Enterprise Partnership, so again from a practitioner's point of view, and Guy will no doubt have a few, from Brunel University, a few choice words to say. So we start with Dylan.
I'll try and be relatively brief so that we can have a good conversation and discussion. So there's just a couple of things that I wanted to say, and this is quite good timing because I think it follows quite nicely from Chris's talk. We can have a look at a few examples. Does anyone know who this chap is? You recognise him? No? Li Shufu, this is China's Henry Ford. Geely, his company, which is one of the most successful private sector Chinese car makers, is it a Chinese company? Headquarters in China, Chinese national, most of its employees are in China, although of course it's taken over Volvo. But what's quite interesting is that of course technically, like many private sector Chinese MNEs, companies, it's not a Chinese company. So this company is listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Its parent company is actually in the Cayman Islands. Why is it relevant? Well, it goes back to the data issues that Chris was talking about, which is that technically FDI is recorded on a bilateral basis. And actually, a lot of the outward foreign direct investment that Geely does originates from offshore tax havens and financial centres like Cayman, BVI, Hong Kong, of course. And from a point of view of understanding Chinese MNEs, this is potentially quite a big issue, which, in my own opinion, hasn't been properly addressed in some of the earlier academic work, particularly work which has relied on official FDI data. So that's one issue which I just flag up. There's another issue, which is that even if you do use commercial databases like the one that Chris is selling, you still have to actually identify the global ultimate owner of a company. And actually in the Chinese case, that can be quite difficult. So it can be quite difficult to pin a nationality on a Chinese MNE. I know because I use some of these commercial databases quite a lot, things like Orbis, and actually you come across many Chinese MNEs where the GUO is certainly not Chinese, and it can be actually very hard to identify. So those are important issues just in terms of thinking about how we understand Chinese MNE activity, because certainly for academics, many academics do large-scale quantitative studies which involve statistical testing and the like. And for me, this is an issue which needs to be flagged up somewhat. Can we therefore measure Chinese outward foreign direct investment better? Probably we can. And it's something that I think academics need to think about. There's also another issue, I think, with quite a bit of the academic work which has been done, which is it tends to lack a comparative element or angle to it. So often we see studies which focus on China alone instead of putting them into an international comparative context. For example, Jeremy's study looking at these partner cities, would it be interesting to compare, say, partner cities in other countries and see if the same kind of relationships actually hold? So that's one issue. A couple of issues facing Chinese studies on Chinese MNEs. What about these companies here? I think in general, just to try and summarise the literature and to give people a sense of what academics have been focusing on, we can just look at a couple more example companies before we move on. Anyone know this company? In the paper a lot recently. Heinrich knows it, of course. Why is it controversial? Yeah. And this is high technology. They make stealth bombers with it. They buy it and they take it back to China and exploit that technology back in China. Chancellor Merkel very upset about this. Many German industrialists tried to stop this from happening. Another example, everyone knows this one, in the papers recently, Syngenta, one of the biggest, agri-chemical groups in the world. Thousands of patents, high-tech. What is ChemChina going to do? A big Chinese state-owned business group. It's going to buy the technology. Again, where is it going to use it? Probably primarily back in China. It will probably buy the company. In fact, this is the plan. Whether it goes through is still unclear because of the CFIUS issue in America where they want to maybe block it. But they're going to buy the technology, perhaps take it back to China and exploit it again in their domestic market. So this is an example similar to KUKA, which we've seen before. Another example, you know this one, Weetabix. Maybe some of you had this for breakfast this morning. This, I'm told by my Chinese students, is incredibly popular now in China, and the sales have soared. Why is that? Because they've bought the brand and they've sold it in China. In other words, we can look at more examples, but I don't want to take up too much time. It seems that the one thing that many of these deals have in common is that actually the Chinese businesses are trying to exploit these assets, strategic assets, intangible assets, brands, technologies, often back in their own domestic market. Wanda, the Chinese business group which bought Odeon, it also bought Sunseeker Yachts, I believe. And again, this is a famous brand, one of the biggest British brands, probably a global brand. They took it back to China and they're going to sell yachts back in China primarily. So there are many common theme, I think, which emerges from a lot of these deals, including the example we saw this morning. What was it? Dynex. Again, it bought the semiconductor to take back to China and increase its sales growth back in China of that particular technology in the Chinese train market. So just to summarise, a lot of the academic literature has focused on this issue of asset seeking, and in particular, I suppose what I wanted to sort of bring home is that, of course, a lot of these acquisitions are made not necessarily for expansion overseas per se, but more to take these technologies back to the Chinese market, exploit them in the Chinese market. And from a kind of an academic point of view, that's quite interesting because quite a lot of the kind of theoretical models don't do such a good job of explaining that kind of behaviour and activity. So academics have focused, if you like, on this theoretical issues to try and extend their theorising and models. There's more that I could talk about in terms of how academics have been thinking about extending their models, things like, for example, business group affiliation and various other home country effects which influence Chinese outward FDI. I don't want to say any more. I think there's just throwing up some examples, a summary of some of my own kind of reflections on Chinese outward FDI, and we can discuss over to the next visionary, luminary speaker.
I suggest that we carry on through and then we have a discussion at the end, okay? So, Jeremy, over to you.
Okay, so this is going to be very brief. Chinese overseas investment evidence. Some sort of evidence. But I'm going to make, I think it would be surprising if many of the points that I intended to make now hadn't already been at least touched on today. As it turns out, they've all been made earlier today. So that actually makes it easier for me. But although China has a very small economic footprint through the activities of its firms in the rest of the world and its FDI values, and the industrial diversity, as we've seen in the recent presentations just then, have grown, it's a general rule that, although small, it actually is of much more interest, of disproportionate interest to host countries. And the reason for that, and it was a point that was made by Chris, and actually I was quite glad it was made by Chris, because it's very difficult to actually get comprehensive data on this, is that most of the FDI outflows from China are, of course, new capital outflows, because, of course, they are new to the world. They are new. They are not hypothecated by location. And this is one of the reasons why we have host countries, host regions, host cities running so eagerly after Chinese foreign direct investment. They don't run after American investment. They don't run after investment from most of the other major investing economies of the world, but they do run over relatively small amounts of money from China. And the reason for this is that they are interested in rooting that investment locally and then growing it. So root it and then grow it. Sounds like I believe in the sort of agricultural approach to FDI, but in fact it's a good way of thinking about it, because this is actually the logic. And the flags figure, which I owe to Hinrich, who's sitting over there, I think he was inspired by the Dad's Army you'll know what I'm talking about, some of you chuckled. The flags demonstrate, the volumes of the flags demonstrate the size of the FDI inflows. And you can see that China, right down at the bottom right there, 0.68%. Well, this was 2014, and it was Eurostat data, so already older than 2014. But you can see that the volumes going into the European Union, in this case, of Chinese investment are very small, even in comparison with other investors from the rest of the world. Nevertheless, the importance that is attached to those FDI flows is much, much larger, and for good reason, because of course it is the impact of that FDI, not just today but in the future. Whereas the American FDI, though much larger in scale, is in its steady state. It's in its sort of long-run static position, equilibrium. So, what we take away into the future is that the dangers for foreign direct investment from China going into the rest of the world, and in particular I'm thinking of the European Union and the United Kingdom, we have the negative response of groups of people towards Chinese investment. We've looked at that already today. We've got a lack of capability on the part of Chinese firms. We haven't actually really talked about that very much today, but Chinese firms do not have a full skill set, and the distribution of their of the way in which these Chinese firms organise their international business is actually quite interesting. Very often they let the foreign affiliates, especially if it's a takeover, more or less sort of carry on running themselves in the way that they have done, for good reason, because they want to buy a successful business model. and therefore the way in which these investments are run after acquisition, and increasingly we've heard also the greenfield, the Chinese are interested in some way in learning and in benefiting from being in the host environment. They do face other problems, such as logistic problems, problems of raising funds abroad, and cross-cultural barriers, which we could spend days discussing the cross-cultural barriers, which are extensive and extremely complicated and very poorly understood. Probably more poorly understood by academics than by business practitioners. But there's a lot of concern as well, of course, in the public domain with the idea of the safety of Chinese and the quality of Chinese firms. I certainly know when I was a kid, and this is a long time ago, we always used to say, oh, made in Hong Kong, you know, it must be rubbish. Of course, actually, it wasn't. It was actually wonderful stuff. Made most of the toys that I was brought up on anyway. And there's poor recognition of Chinese brands among foreign consumers. But do you recognise the... oops, no, jump to the... no. We've lost some slides here. Oh, never mind, doesn't matter. There was a picture which had some Chinese brands on it. But basically there's a huge tranche of Chinese firms. We've got Huawei, we've heard from Huawei, but we've got a huge tranche of the next wave of Chinese firms to internationalize. And the question for us is, if the Chinese firms, the next wave, internationalize in the same way that the Japanese do, then in 5-10 years' time, we will be having as household names in this country Chinese brands and Chinese products which today we haven't heard of, but will become an intrinsic part of our lives in the same way that Japanese products have done. And if that is the case, we will wish to have a share of that action within the UK and within the European Union. And so I think that our conclusions are that it's very difficult to measure foreign investment accurately. And what we really want is not just investment statistics. And it seems that, although Chris has gone, and it seems that his work does involve developing operational data. Well, this is the way ahead. So what we mean by operational data is employees, not only the direct effect of how many people employed, what is the direct income generated by affiliates, but what about the indirect effects? The income which is generated in the local economy beyond the affiliate itself. What are therefore the benefits in terms of the circular flow of income, the regional income multiplier, the national income multiplier? What effect do these firms have? At the moment we don't know, and we need good statistics to be able to help us to do that. So, in the statistics domain, it's true that we need far more evidence. And so, you were very wise when you said we need evidence, and we need to think about the evidence, because we want to know what is the benefit from FDI, not just what the value of FDI, the number of deals, and so on is. That's the challenge for the future. And I think that as academics, we need to work much more closely with our business practitioner friends in trying to articulate and understand that process, and to try to gauge the impact of investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DJ. That's excellent. Stephen, then, I wonder if you could give your presentation from a more practitioner's point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon. Seems a long time to sit and wait before I can say a few words, but I'm delighted that Chris has gone, because the first thing I was going to do was give you a statistic, and I was terrified while he was sitting there that when I gave my statistic, he would say, no, that's not right, that's not what the FT believe in. But just to give you, again, coming on from what Jeremy said, the latest figures from UKTI about FDI from last year in terms of numbers gave the Chinese FDI figure at 156 for the whole country. Now that doesn't sound a lot, but when you think that that now is the second largest number from any country, with USA still being the first, but that just shows you in terms of numbers And I agree entirely what Jeremy says. There are sort of other pieces of evidence we need to know about what those absolute numbers in terms of FDI means, in terms of value, in terms of further impact. But FDI, an important component of the job I'm trying to do, which is to bring continued growth to the area, FDI plays a big role in that. We in the SEMLEP extended area have a good track record on that, but nationally you now see the Chinese FDI is making a significant contribution to number. The second thing I'd say, which was again touched upon, is that interestingly most FDI that I've been involved with, particularly up in the northeast, something like 70% of that FDI normally is existing foreign companies expanding their operations, which is what a lot of that American FDI will be that was shown. Because of the relative numbers and the relative recent history of Chinese FDI, it is, as Chris was saying and others have spoken, it is new investment. It is genuinely new investment, new companies coming in. And over a period of time, as Jeremy said, we will see that, one hopes, become steady state, where those companies that have come will then expand into those areas. So FDI, really important for us. In terms of how do we capture more, certainly something that's exercised my mind, one of the other pieces of research I think would be very interesting, and it comes back to the Nottingham example and the sister cities. That, to me, and people will know I espoused this around the table last night at dinner without seeing any of the evidence, is that seems to me a way of entering the Chinese market and getting FDI through existing relationships. Because China will be a country and a society that needs a building of relationships rather than just cold calling from people like me or companies to come and say, come and invest. And one of the interesting things I think would be to look at that 156 Chinese investments, FDI, and see if they can be mapped in any way to those that have got existing relationships between sister states, sister cities. Because if they can't, then my, if you like, intuitive belief that that's the right way to go about it, as we've heard from Nottingham, would be undermined if actually it's a more of a scattergun approach that appears to have happened from the FDI figures. So I think it's an interesting piece of research that we should be able to do to see how closely are the numbers matching to the locations that have already got established relationships. And beyond that, in the sense I've done FDI for quite some years, I don't think, apart from understanding the obvious differences between the Chinese system, the Chinese culture, our culture, and other foreign cultures that we engage with, FDI is always best done if you focus on what you're trying to achieve. So establishing relationships, doing all the sort of things we've talked about, focusing, all the things Chris went through as the best ways of approaching companies or regions over there, are not rocket science. They are the things we have done with successive countries over their successive waves of FDI. I would say, and again I don't want to offend anyone, but this seems to me much closer to the Japanese experience we've had than perhaps the American experience, where we have to learn a culture which is more about building relationships rather than instant relationships which then lead to instant business. I think that's the big thing we need to learn. I'd say again, the other interesting thing is that from practitioners' side, how we're going to track this, and I thought the comment about the move, unfortunately in my case, from Milton Keynes over to the west of London from the company this morning, again, what we need to focus on are what are our attributes in our own particular areas. Again, going there and saying, or part of a delegation that says, we can provide you with locations which will help you do this. If genuinely you don't have the skills or you're not connected to the other players in that industry, which is why, in a sense, the Western Corridor with the telecommunication firms is an ideal location for the Chinese company that moved down to Milton Keynes. So I think the lesson we have to learn, which is true of all FDI, is you don't play up things that are not assets and don't play up things that you are not skilled in. You have to concentrate on what are our special over and above the rest of the country attributes, and then try and target that for the FDI. One of the interesting things, we've been talking, Adrian and I, agri-food, agri-things, this area is absolutely good at, along with other parts, North Yorkshire, York, and those sort of things. We ought to be able to then concentrate on one of those sectors and make a much more focused approach and a much more focused offer. Because the key thing will be, as said earlier, what is it the Chinese want company-wise from here, and what is the offer we can make to make that work? I'll just finish up with Brexit, because like most people, I'm obsessed with Brexit at the moment. I thought that there's some interesting strands that again came out this morning. I have no evidence, I'm not an academic, I don't do any research, I just make things up as I go along. I think there's an interesting difference between existing Chinese companies who came here because UK is a bridgehead to Europe, and we heard this morning again for the company that has decided not to invest more in this company, in this country, but will invest more in Germany because the European connection is very important to them. As against the new Chinese companies and the new wave of private Chinese companies that may be coming here for things like our own market, access to, as was said this morning, free trade, the possibility that if you establish in this market, you then have kudos in other world markets. So I think there's an interesting difference. And the fact that most of the FDI coming from China now is new companies setting up new activities, I suspect that gives us a better chance post-Brexit than obviously with existing Chinese companies or other nationalities. It's no surprise Japanese and American presidents and others made this comment to Theresa May, because they're here, a lot of them, because it's a bridgehead into Europe. So I think there's a difference there that we can perhaps exploit. The opposite side to that coin is exactly the point that was made by Dylan, that if actually the companies are coming here to harness our technology and taking it back to China, arguably long term that isn't a great position for us to be in. And that has to be weighed up with instant trade, which we may be losing as a result of coming out of Brexit, instant jobs, which again we'd be looking for, instant added benefit in terms of indirect jobs and other things into the economy that Jeremy was talking about, but weighed against the long-term drain of our technology elsewhere. And therefore I think post-Brexit will turn out to be very interesting, as we all know. I think there's a real opportunity to attract Chinese companies, but I think there's a real an investigation and research needs to go on exactly why the company's coming and what is likely to happen long term. I was also intrigued, I've had a conversation with Peter earlier about the company's more dialects. I could not work out, not close to it, why the Chinese company bought them. Because all the slides told us was that all the improvements were coming from China to here. So if the low power work has already gone to China, what's to stop the high power work going to China at the convenient time? There must be a reason, and it's been explained to me better, but I think there is that suspicion still about that Chinese companies here are not coming here necessarily to eventually boost our economy, it's to boost their own economy, as you'd expect. And I think that's something we just need to keep a weathered eye on. Thank you.
Lastly, Guy.
Thanks. Thanks for two previous speakers. I don't have much to say. Basically, what I try to raise the question rather than state something. The question is that in order to convince Chinese company to invest in the UK, one of the study, possibly I haven't heard it during the day's presentation, is that the performance of the FDI and particularly Chinese FDI, based on the statistics, more than around 85% of the Chinese FDI over the world are making losses. So that's make a question how this Chinese FDI can be sustainable when they invest outside China, including the Chinese FDI in the UK as well. Most of them are actually losing the money. So only a few of them make money. I think that possibly a couple of the reasons we can think about are based on my own personal observation and the case, which is I was an advisor. And one reason is that is due diligence pre-merger. A lot of companies are actually, when they come to West to do the FDI, they haven't done very much about due diligence. They think that they can save the money because we know that due diligence is very expensive. The case I experienced is that £20 million takeover cost them about £1.5 million spent on due diligence, including the legal due diligence. Some companies, they try to be smart and then try to save the money or cut the cost, say, oh, I understand the labor issue, I understand that things, I can look at the website. Then afterwards, they are in trouble because they are not fully aware of the complication or the business environment in the investing country. So I think the one thing is, the due diligence before the mergers. The case I experienced, they are profitable for 5 years after merge because they have done a good due diligence. Because I asked them, because I was advisor, I asked them do every aspect of due diligence. And then before that, they have a fully understand what the business is about and how to pursue and then make the right strategy after the merge. So that's the one reason we can look at why most of Chinese FDIs are actually losing money. And we can possibly from that to explain. The second is that it's a governance model after the mergers. I summarize that there's two governance models. One is that you leave local management. The case I experienced that the Chinese, with the Chongqing Electric and Machine Group, when they acquired the company, they leave to the local management. They appoint the CEO who was a production manager of the local company and then promote him to be a CEO. And then he leave him to lead the company. So basically the Chinese investors, they don't send any of their people here. They leave him. In the trust, I trust you. But they do give him a target. As long as they fulfill targets, they're happy. Certainly they target the financial targets, there's other targets as well. And they sign this contract. The contract. Very interesting. Over the past 5 years, they make profits. And then the company, which is the local manager, he's happy, he got the bonus. Then 1 year, which is last year, they lost money. And the Chinese way says, okay, I trust you, I let you to lead the local company. And you sign the contract, if you make money, you increase your pay next year. If you lose money, sorry, I have to deduct your pay next year. You know British culture. If your manager or your, the authorities say, next year your pay will be deducted. Nobody will say, oh, this is not right, you cannot deduct my pay. You can reduce my bonus, but not salary. And that's the culture of the Britain. And the certain manager called me in the early morning and said, Guy, can you help me? I said, what? They cut my salary. That's not good. I say, is this contract said that? He said, I don't believe the contract said that. I sent me the contract, and the contract was saying that. I didn't read the contract properly. And they tried to take the case to the court. I said, don't do that. That's not the culture of China. If you went to the court, you'll finish. But I say that I can help you to explain, this something, culture of Britain, and don't do that. Use another way. He said, okay, I can pay some money back. Because I took the bonus, I can pay some bonus back, but don't cut my fixed salary. So I talked to the Chinese side, and then so at the end, they compromise, say, okay, you symbolically pay some money back, but we don't cut your salary. So you can see some, the culture conflict. But however, this shows that this sort of is called leaving local management model. It has its beauty, but also has some issues. The another model is that Chinese-led management. A friend of mine acquired a company which made a security van. And then he sent his own person to go to the company and manage, like this morning, the Chinese company, they send their own Chinese manager. Well, to some extent, this model is good because China, they send their own people. If that person is capable and competent and have a good understanding about British culture and the management style, that possibly fine. If that person has a language problem, has an understanding of the culture problem and things, then easily it will fall apart. And then it will create a tension, and then will make the companies doesn't work, and at the end we lose the money. So I don't know whether or not these sort of things is caused by that. And that's the third element is resources support after merger. A lot of Chinese company, they thought that I pay, amount of money to acquire them, then I finish. Then the rest is that I want to see the profit. It's not that. They need to provide working capital afterwards, they need to provide support afterwards. So if they don't have that mind, or they don't have that kind of preparation, easily it's end up with some problems. And the case I experienced, even the company I say is profitable, but the Chinese side provide lots working capital. It's about 10 million over the 5 years as a working capital in cash inject into the business. So that sort of things give us, which is idea whether or not the post-merger resource support is another kind of determinant of the success in terms of performance after mergers. So that's my question I raised to say, what determines the performance of the Chinese FDI after they come to UK? The last is your point, which is called Brexit. From my observation and my contact and my talk with the Chinese investors, they are happy about Brexit. They say that first, it's cheaper because during devaluation, at least 10% or more than 10% is cheaper than in acquiring any assets in Britain. So they love, they come to here to buy anything they could buy. First. Second, they are looking forward the corporate tax reduction. Because of this Brexit, immediately created competition between European government and the British government in terms of creating a friendly business environment for the corporations. In the UK, they immediately announced that 15% corporate tax start in the 2018. That's wonderful news for any investors, foreign investors come to UK. So they will choose UK as a head office unless European government also reduce corporate tax to 15%. But I doubt they can because they got 26 members. So they cannot like that, like UK government. So the decision of our UK government will be more efficient and more business friendly approach. So that's why the Chinese really looking forward that. And then further, you could see that the British government immediately recognized Chinese market data, and the European government also jumped in. Even in May this year, European government just make a decision, say, no market data for China. After Brexit, yesterday, they finally accept this has been going around for 10 years and because of Brexit. So I think I should thank Brexit and really good in terms of Chinese aspect. It's good news and a good move for them. Thank you.
Okay, 10 minutes now, I think, for a general discussion with all the panel members. Any questions? Adrian.
Yeah, Richard, let me ask a question that's got the geopolitics of this. The geopolitics of this whole Chinese FDI, I think, are fascinating. And the issue of China and soft power and hard power. Now, we had a minister here today. He didn't really reveal any policy sort of issues. But what is the panel's consideration in terms of, the context in which business will take place? And is there a sort of grand master plan here in China of the key strategic assets that they want to get a hold of? You see it in Latin America, you see it in Africa, taking hold of mineral, etc. The FDI stats split them out between SOEs and private, etc. So I'm quite concerned about, well, not concerned, I'm fascinated by the geopolitics. I think the One Belt, One Road policy is magnificent and is a great example of Chinese soft power in Asia. Some of the things we're seeing in the South China Seas look like a bit of hard power. I think how that plays out will have a massive influence on so much of the FDI flows in the future, but I'd like to hear what the panel have to think about the geopolitics.
Anyone would like to respond to that? There's a guy.
Well, the soft power, my understanding is that the China, they are seeking the recognition of their culture and their development model. That's they want to. They are not trying to say that, okay, I try to influence the world and I export my model to every country in the world. That's not their intention. But they do want the recognition of their development model. For example, we say, the state enterprises or the public economy as a dominance in the Chinese economy. They want people recognize the development model and then recognize the culture. That's all about. So that's called soft power. So in terms of how relate to FDI, certainly, if some company come to China to acquire, this soft power related business, behind that, I guess, they can get some government support or finance support, and so that's why I understand it. And possibly others are better speaking on that aspect and the issue.
I mean, all I would say is that I think it's very interesting to take account of the growth of the private sector, which, I mean, as Chris said, has been, he said 80% of investment in the US is private sector investment, and that's really something to some extent which has been a bit overlooked in the past, at least in my opinion. So, in other words, seeing Chinese sort of multinational activity as some kind of process driven by the state is of course, there are state-owned enterprises and they do the biggest deals, but there's a great deal of private sector investment. And I think it's my own reflection on reading certainly academics' interpretation of what China's doing, is that there is this kind of tendency to see the Chinese state as being really in control, whereas in reality I believe it to be slightly more chaotic than that.
I think for me, it would be a surprise if we were surprised that the country that's going to be the largest economic power in 10 years in the world isn't looking at geopolitical issues as well as, if you like, economic issues. So, I don't think there's any shock in that. Perhaps the way certain bits of it have gone about are different to how it's been done in the past. But if you look at America and American economic power and how that's used around the world, and South America and whatever, those things inevitably follow from superpower status. I just think in our case of being what's now going to be a small island off of Europe, it's how we marry that economic power with benefit to ourselves. And I think that's the key bit for me. I think it is inconceivable that China becoming the most prosperous economy in the world, even if it doesn't go to all its population, won't have some aspirations on a geopolitical level, and will use that power in hard and soft ways, and use its economic power, if you like, to pursue some of its aims. I think those countries that trade with it with their eyes open, and if you like, can have a friendly economic relationship with them, will benefit greatly. And I think we just have to make sure that this country has its eyes open when it trades with China, because again, I think it's inconceivable that you would not trade as a trading nation as we are with the largest economic power in the world. Our closest trading partner is Europe for obvious reasons, but America comes pretty closely behind that. So I think that just follows as night follows day. Economic power brings other aspirations, and they have to be fulfilled in a certain way.
I think one of the things that we haven't had the chance to talk about today is the bilateral relationship between the UK and China, and between the European Union and China in respect of the way in which trade and investment is governed. Many of you will know that the European Union is about to negotiate a bilateral investment treaty with China, a super bilateral investment treaty or international investment agreement. Many of you will know that there is no discrimination against third country investment into the European Union. That means to say that a French firm can invest as readily in the UK as a Chinese firm can invest in the UK or anywhere else in the European Union. It's possible to discriminate against third country investment, but it doesn't make sense in today's world to do so. However, Chinese industry is barriered in some parts to foreign investment. And this is one of the things, of course, that is in the interests of the UK, the European Union, to negotiate down the barriers against investment in those sectors in which we particularly have strategic interests and competitive advantages in Europe. One of the things that we haven't addressed today is that in looking at Chinese investment into the European Union and into the UK, is that coming from China into Europe, into the UK, because it's not possible so easily for the Western, for the UK or European investment to invest in China. Certainly we don't have a level playing field. Now, Those Chinese colleagues amongst us will know that China is a developing economy and therefore can defend the argument that China should have some restrictions on inward investment. However, these restrictions become less and less easy to defend the more developed China is and the more its investment is in the West. And so we've been talking about power just in the last minutes, and I think it's time for us to look objectively at that power and say, well, has China come on sufficiently that it should open up its market more to European firms, because the European industry is at the moment wide open to Chinese investment, and it's fair that it should be so. It's the same to any other economy in the world, including economies of the European Union, member states of the European Union. But looking at that balance, it's not just a matter of bargaining power, it's a matter of actually revisiting that relationship and saying, well, is it not time that we actually had greater access to the Chinese market? Because it's perfectly possible that we may be, in a sense, prejudicing ourselves, and that maybe the investment that comes from China into the European Union may be advantaged precisely because it's not possible for the investment to go the other way. I don't know whether that's true. We'll need to have some research on that in the future, and certainly I think we have to visit the way in which trade and investment is governed in the future. Certainly the United Kingdom is going to have to take a long, hard look at the way in which its trade and investment relations are governed with the rest of the world if it goes through with Brexit.
It's possible that I can add something that is already. Professor Nick Miles probably knows this better in terms of the government, the national government, because he has met Wen Jiabao himself, but I haven't. But I personally don't think there is a grand plan by the national government. Having said that, though, I think many Chinese businesses, including private business, they will respond to whatever government initiatives. Now, give you an example. Talking to Andrew Yuan yesterday, he said his boss, his business is a private business. Now, his boss went to Germany and acquired a German company, I think 2 years ago. Despite all the risks and costs being warned against about the deal. Now, the reason that his boss wanted to have that deal, have that acquisition, is because that he was able to go back to the party secretary general of Shenzhen, where he came from. That, because that party secretary general had an ambition to create another 5 global 500 company in his tenure. So perhaps in 4 or 5 years' time. So now his boss wanted to show to the party secretary general, look, I have the potential, therefore you should give me some favorable policy or treatment, whatever. So that's part of the rationales behind the acquisition and motivations behind the acquisition. So it's a very interesting case here in terms of the motivation, but also probably reflected about something about behind the national government initiative. I don't know if Professor Nick Miles wants to add anything.
So the point I'm looking at is it's not homogeneous. There's a policy from, as you well know, from central government it kind of comes down the line, and it's played out in different ways at different times, and cities want advantages, and we've had advantage being in Ningbo for certain policies around the margin, but we're not the only people. So there's lots of experiments going on from the central government. And I take Stephen's point, he's exactly right. You have to be in the game to win it, and being in the game is about navigating a landscape that kind of moves all the time, and except that's the game you're in, and if you do, things work for you. Things actually work very well for me, but it's changing, and it's not just one thing, it happens in many multiple and different ways. I think you just got to feel comfortable with doing that. If you feel comfortable, it works. If you don't feel comfortable, don't be there. You know, I think that's my take.
I'd add to that from a personal experience, because I've only been here a few months. Up in the northeast, the Redcar Steelworks shut. And the Redcar Steelworks shut because the tyre company that owned it could no longer make it. It didn't work for quite some time. And one of the reasons given, maybe not correctly, but one of the reasons given was dumping by Chinese of steel on the markets, world markets, because their economy and their was slowing. And in a sense, what we heard this morning from the Minister about who are the three biggest steel producers, you suddenly realise that that may not have been, if you like, a malign policy which was agreed in the Bureau of the state government, etc. It is a reaction because of the scale of the industry that the Chinese are operating at. And so we were an unfortunate sort of byproduct of that. We lost 2,000 jobs, 3,000 indirect jobs, and we were really upset, and particularly upset about the Chinese if that's what the case. But you know, when you see the scale of the steel industry they've got and how they then had to cope with a downturn perhaps in theirs, you know, I think the thing that I still struggle with is the scale of the economy and the quickness of the scale of that economy that it's built to. And that is, I agree entirely, that you've got to manoeuvre around positions that may be uncomfortable for you because you have to accept you are dealing now with an economic powerhouse that swamps you, and you have to accept that you're going to have some difficult times in that, but if you can get that relationship right, then you will benefit ultimately from that. If you don't get it right, you are going to lose out in the wake of what is it's a tanker going forward. And that, I think, is a really important lesson to learn, that sometimes the consequences are not planned. They're not a devilish plan to have got rid of the Redcar competition, because it effectively was no competition. It's just the scale of what we're talking about makes the consequences so much worse for a country of our size, with the diminution of our manufacturing that we've now got in this country.
I would like to comment on some very fruitful insights from Dylan and Guy. I completely agree with Guy in terms of the importance of due diligence for Chinese acquirers. It's actually in line with some of my research findings. That research looking at the key prior related knowledge of Chinese acquirers when they are acquiring firms in the developed economy, and the prior knowledge about the target firm is one of the key prior knowledge, and it can influence Chinese firms' absorptive capacity so as to facilitate the reverse knowledge transfer. But I'm also interested in the case that you mentioned that the Chinese acquirer refused to pay the high due diligence fee. As £1 million is quite a ridiculous number to me. But the thing is, I guess the underlying rationale of the Chinese acquirer's decision on the due diligence fee is probably in line with Dylan's comment on the Chinese acquirer's motivation behind the deal. And that's actually probably can be linked to the interesting story Andrew shared to me and Xiaowei last night. So although there are lots of so-called strategic asset-seeking M&A, but why those Chinese firms want to buy those European firms, it's probably because they just want to acquire certain so-called strategic asset and use that asset in the Chinese market. They don't really care about whether they can operate the acquired firm smoothly in the future. So they don't really care about every detail behind the scene. They don't really care about if the acquired firm can earn profit in the future. Because if they can transfer certain knowledge from the acquired firm to the parent firm, they can use their knowledge in the domestic market to exploit the knowledge transferred from the acquired firm to earn profit in the Chinese market. In that case, they wouldn't waste £1 million to gather the full detailed information from the acquired firm. They don't really care about those, smooth operation in the future. Doesn't really matter. And yes, that's just because the Chinese market is so vast, right? I guess one of the main reasons those acquired firms in developed economies can be acquired by Chinese firms is that they failed to get access, failed to operate smoothly in emerging markets. If they could get access to the Chinese market before the acquisition, they probably would earn enough profit, and they can probably save themselves from being acquired by Chinese acquirers. So those outward acquisition by Chinese firms is, in my opinion, is like sort of helping those firms in developed economies entering into Chinese market. It's just the difference is the main shareholder is now Chinese people.
Can we just thank very much indeed the panel for coming today. It's been a long afternoon, and I think the contributions have all been exceptionally insightful and enjoyable to listen to. Thank you very much to all of the panel.